The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 7B, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. Judge William Harrison, a man in his late 50s with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses, sat behind his imposing desk. His black robe was pressed and perfect as always. The clock on the wall showed 9:15 a.m., and the room was already filled with nervous energy from the 23 people waiting for their traffic cases to be heard. Sarah Thompson sat in the third row, her dark blue business suit setting her apart from the casually dressed defendants. At 42, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had built something from nothing. Her successful chain of organic grocery stores employed over 100 people across the city. But in traffic court, none of that mattered. She checked her watch again, her fingers lightly tapping the leather briefcase on her lap. "All rise." The bailiff's voice boomed through the room. The Honorable Judge William Harrison presiding. The shuffle of feet and rustle of clothing filled the air as everyone stood. Judge Harrison nodded briefly, his face maintaining its usual stern expression. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years on the bench. The morning proceeded with its usual rhythm. A young college student stammered through an explanation for his speeding ticket. An elderly man argued about a parking violation. A middle-aged woman cried as she described her inability to afford the fine. Through it all, Judge Harrison maintained his reputation for being strict but fair. Though his fairness often leaned heavily toward strict, Sarah watched each case carefully, noting how the judge's patience seemed to wear thinner with each passing hour. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background, barely masking the nervous whispers of those still waiting. A young intern rushed in with a stack of papers, nearly tripping over her own feet. She earned a sharp look from the judge, which made her face flush red. Officer Mike Reynolds, a veteran traffic cop known for his detailed reports, stood at attention near the prosecutor's table. His blue uniform was crisp despite the late August heat. Every now and then, he sipped water from a paper cup, his eyes constantly scanning the room out of habit. The court clerk, Mrs. Jenkins, who had served in this courtroom longer than Judge Harrison himself, efficiently moved through the docket. Her reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck, and her fingers moved across her keyboard with practiced precision. She had seen thousands of cases, but something about Sarah Thompson's file made her pause briefly while reviewing it. As the morning wore on, the wooden benches grew increasingly uncomfortable. A baby started crying in the back, prompting its mother to rush out quickly, drawing another disapproving glance from Judge Harrison. His reputation for running a tight ship was well known throughout Springfield County. Local attorneys often joked that even the clock ran faster when Harrison demanded it. Sarah noticed small details others might have missed. The way Judge Harrison's left hand tapped his desk 3 times before announcing each fine, how he never looked directly at defendants when they first approached, but always studied their reactions after delivering judgment, and the slight tilt of his head when something caught his interest. Behind the judge's bench, Officer Marcus Chin maintained his position with a presence both reassuring and intimidating. Having worked with Judge Harrison for 8 years, he could almost predict when the judge would call for order, his hand moving toward the gavel seconds before it was needed. Outside the tall windows, life in Springfield continued as usual. Cars honked in the distance, and the massive oak tree in the courthouse yard cast shifting shadows across the room. A construction project across the street added occasional muffled booms to the courtroom's atmosphere, making some defendants jump in their seats. As the clock approached noon, Sarah felt her case drawing nearer. She reviewed her documentation one last time, even though she had memorized every detail. Her traffic violations seemed minor compared to others she had witnessed that morning, but she knew better than to make assumptions in Judge Harrison's courtroom. Years of business experience had taught her that preparation was everything. Yet, something in the judge's demeanor suggested this might be one of those times when preparation alone wouldn't be enough. The air in the courtroom grew heavier with anticipation as Mrs. Jenkins shuffled her papers, preparing to call the next case. Sarah straightened her spine, adjusted her collar, and took a deep breath. Years of managing business crises had trained her to remain calm under pressure, but something about this morning felt different. Perhaps it was the way Judge Harrison's gavel seemed to fall with increasing force as the morning progressed, or maybe it was the subtle changes in his tone with each passing case. Case number 247, Sarah Thompson. Mrs. Jenkins called out, her voice clear and professional in the quiet courtroom. Sarah stood up smoothly, gathering her briefcase and documents with practiced ease. As she walked toward the front, several heads turned to watch her. Her presence commanded attention without trying. Judge Harrison, still writing notes about the previous case, didn't look up as Sarah took her position behind the defendant's podium. Officer Reynolds stepped forward, holding his citation book and preparing to present his evidence. Miss Thompson, Judge Harrison began, still focused on his papers, you are charged with failing to stop at a traffic signal that had turned red. How do you plead? His tone carried the same weight and finality it had all morning, a voice that had pronounced thousands of judgments over his career. Sarah cleared her throat softly. Not guilty, Your Honor, she replied, her voice steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the courtroom. For the first time, Judge Harrison glanced up. His eyes met hers briefly before moving to the citation in front of him. Officer Reynolds stepped forward. Your Honor, on July 15th, at approximately 8:45 a.m., I observed Miss Thompson's vehicle, a black Mercedes SUV, entering the intersection of Main and Oak Streets as the light turned red. The weather was clear, visibility was excellent, and there were no obstructions to the traffic signals. The judge nodded, making another note. The morning sun had shifted, casting harsh shadows across his face and making his expression even more severe. Sarah noticed how his left hand tapped the desk 3 times, the same pattern she had observed earlier. Miss Thompson, Judge Harrison said, do you have anything to say in your defense? Sarah opened her briefcase and removed a single sheet of paper. Yes, Your Honor, she replied. I have dash cam footage from my vehicle showing that the light was yellow when I entered the intersection. Additionally, there was a delivery truck close behind my vehicle, and I determined it would have been more dangerous to attempt a sudden stop. This caught Judge Harrison's attention. Most defendants came with excuses. Few brought evidence. He looked up properly for the first time, studying Sarah's face. She met his gaze steadily, her expression professional and composed. Officer Reynolds, the judge turned to the police officer. Did you observe a delivery truck behind Miss Thompson's vehicle? Officer Reynolds shifted slightly. I was positioned at the corner, Your Honor. My focus was on vehicles crossing the intersection. I can't confirm or deny the presence of a truck behind her vehicle. The courtroom grew quieter than usual. The regular audience, used to quick guilty pleas and rapid fines, sensed something different about this case. Even Mrs. Jenkins had stopped typing, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. Sarah continued, her tone remaining professional. I have been driving for 24 years, Your Honor, with no prior traffic violations. I own several businesses in this community and understand the importance of traffic safety. My decision in that moment was based on what I believed would prevent an accident. Judge Harrison's expression remained unreadable, but his fingers stopped their habitual tapping. He studied the dash cam footage printout Sarah had submitted, then glanced back at Officer Reynolds' citation. The air conditioning clicked on, adding a soft hum to the tense silence. Miss Thompson, Judge Harrison began, his tone carrying a note of skepticism absent in earlier cases. While I appreciate your detailed explanation, the fact remains that Officer Reynolds, a trained professional with 15 years of experience, observed your vehicle entering the intersection after the light had turned red. Sarah's posture remained poised, though those watching closely might have noticed her grip on the podium tighten slightly. The sunlight now illuminated her face, highlighting the dignity in her expression as she prepared to respond to the judge's doubt. Behind her, the remaining defendants leaned forward, sensing they were witnessing something unusual. The courtroom, used to the monotony of routine cases, had fallen into an expectant hush. Judge Harrison leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes moving between the citation and Sarah's evidence. The usual swift efficiency of his courtroom gave way to a rare moment of genuine deliberation. Finally, he straightened, his expression hardening into the stern demeanor his courtroom regulars knew well. Miss Thompson, he began, his voice steady and firm. While I appreciate your detailed presentation and clean driving record, this court must maintain strict standards regarding traffic signals. Sarah stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her. The only sign of tension was a slight tightening around her eyes. Behind her, the other defendants watched intently. Your fine will be $400, Judge Harrison continued, raising his gavel, plus court costs of $85. The amount was at the higher end of the typical range for such cases. A soft murmur rippled through the audience. Even Officer Reynolds, standing near the prosecutor's table, shifted uncomfortably, as if surprised by the severity of the fine. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, not anger or frustration, but a deep disappointment that seemed to go beyond the fine itself. She reached into her briefcase and calmly pulled out her checkbook. Your Honor, she said clearly, I respect this court's decision. However, I would like the record to show that I presented evidence that was not fully considered. She paused, then added, sometimes, what seems clear at first glance deserves a second look. The judge's hand tightened slightly on his gavel. Something about her words, or the way she said them, made him look at her properly for the first time. Miss Thompson, he began, his tone carrying a warning, are you suggesting this court has not given your case proper consideration? Her voice remained steady. No, Your Honor. I'm suggesting that justice, like safety, sometimes requires us to look beyond first impressions. The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers and quiet whispers had ceased. Officer Chen, the bailiff, found himself holding his breath, sensing this case carried more weight than a routine traffic violation. Judge Harrison's face flushed slightly. He raised his gavel again, then paused, a rare hesitation for him. Finally he spoke. This court's decision stands, Miss Thompson. Pay the fine with the clerk. Next case. The gavel fell with a sharp crack, louder than usual in the hushed room. Sarah nodded once, turned, and walked to Mrs. Jenkins' desk. Her heels clicked softly on the polished floor, the sound emphasizing the continuing silence. As she wrote her check, her hands were steady. Mrs. Jenkins noted that Sarah's signature was clear and precise, not the angry scrawl she often saw from defendants. When Sarah turned to leave, she walked with the same calm dignity she had shown throughout the proceedings. Judge Harrison had already called the next case, but his eyes followed her exit. Something about her composure unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite identify. As Sarah reached the courtroom doors, the afternoon sun cast her figure into silhouette. For a moment, she paused, hand on the door handle. Without looking back, she opened the door and stepped into the hallway, leaving behind a courtroom that felt subtly changed by her presence. Judge Harrison forced his attention back to the next case, but his usual rhythm fell off. His left hand no longer tapped its habitual pattern on the desk. The weight of his robe seemed heavier than usual. Later that evening, Judge William Harrison sat in his private study at home, surrounded by campaign finance documents. The day's court sessions were over, but his last interaction with Sarah Thompson lingered in his mind. The study's warm oak paneling and soft lamplight usually helped him relax, but not tonight. Linda Martinez, his campaign manager of 6 years, sat across from him. Her reading glasses perched on her nose as she sorted through papers with practiced efficiency. William, you'll be happy to know we've had a strong quarter, Linda said, pulling out a particularly thick folder. Several of our long-term supporters have increased their contributions. She spread documents across the mahogany desk, creating neat piles of donor information. The judge nodded absently, his mind still partially in the courtroom. The ceiling fan spun lazily above, creating a gentle breeze that rustled the papers. Outside, the streetlights had just come on, casting long shadows through the study windows. Here's our list of top donors from the past 5 years, Linda continued, sliding a paper toward him. These are the people we really need to focus on for the upcoming fundraiser next month. Judge Harrison picked up the list more out of habit than interest. His eyes scanned the column of names, barely registering them until one caught his attention. His hand froze mid-page turn. Linda, he said, his voice rougher than usual. Is this correct? He pointed to a name near the top of the list. Sarah Thompson, $225,000. Linda leaned forward, adjusting her glasses. Oh yes, Sarah Thompson. She's been one of our most consistent supporters, not just with monetary contributions. She's hosted 3 fundraisers at her home in the past 2 years. Her organic grocery chain has also catered several of our campaign events, often at cost. The judge's face paled slightly, and he loosened his tie, feeling the day's weight press down on him. Tell me more about her, he said, trying to steady his voice. Linda brightened as she pulled out another file. She's remarkable, really. Started her business from scratch 15 years ago, and now she owns 6 stores across the county. She's on the Chamber of Commerce board, runs a scholarship program for underprivileged students, and Linda paused, noticing the judge's increasingly distressed expression. William, is everything all right? Judge Harrison stood abruptly, walking to the window. The evening traffic below moved steadily, car lights creating streams of red and white in the darkness. I had her in my courtroom today, he said quietly. Linda's voice carried a note of curiosity. What for? A traffic violation, he admitted, turning back to face her. I fined her heavily. I didn't give her evidence the consideration it deserved. Linda's eyebrows rose in surprise. She had known William Harrison for years, had seen him handle countless campaign challenges, but she had never seen him look so troubled. She tried to present dash cam footage, he continued, more to himself than to Linda. She was prepared, professional, respectful, and I dismissed her without really looking at the evidence. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9 times, the deep tones echoing in the quiet room. The judge sat heavily in his leather chair, the donor list still in his hand. For the first time in his 20 years on the bench, he felt the full weight of his quick judgment. Linda cleared her throat softly. William, we all make snap judgments sometimes. It's part of being human. But Judge Harrison wasn't listening. He was replaying Sarah's words in his mind about taking a second look. The dignity in her bearing, the calm professionalism in her tone, it all stood in stark contrast to his dismissive attitude. At 3 a.m., unable to sleep, the judge found himself back in his study, still wearing his blue-striped pajamas. He opened the court records from the past month and began reviewing his decisions. For 2 hours, he worked in silence. A pattern began to emerge that made his stomach tighten. Drivers from wealthy neighborhoods often received warnings or minimal fines. Meanwhile, defendants from minority communities faced higher penalties for similar violations. As dawn broke, Judge Harrison sat at his desk, staring at the growing pile of evidence in front of him. His coffee sat untouched, growing cold. Outside, the city was beginning to wake, but his mind was still stuck on the courtroom, the faces of the defendants he had judged, and the biases he had failed to recognize. When his phone buzzed, it was a text from Linda. Don't forget about the Chamber of Commerce lunch today. Sarah Thompson will be there. His hands trembled slightly as he set the phone down. The thought of facing Sarah made his chest tighten. By 7:30 a.m., he was in his chambers, dressed more casually than usual, surprising Mrs. Jenkins. Your Honor, she greeted him, noting his uncharacteristically early arrival. I've cleared your morning calendar as you requested. Thank you, Martha, he replied, using her first name for the first time in years. Can you help me gather the traffic cases from the past 6 months? I'll need all the files.